So this video focuses on AD, Active Directory integration with your Synology NAS. Now this is only going to be really necessary for people who do run an Active Directory environment. Of course, AD is a spot that you can actually manage users and security groups, generally within a business context, to be able to just simplify logins of all of your computers, your servers, your storage devices such as a Synology NAS right here. So rather than using the built-in users that we did cover in the previous video, where we looked at the different users and the different groups, well, now we're talking about domains. We're talking about specifically how to connect your NAS to a Active Directory domain and get it running and be able to use Active Directory users and security groups to be able to log in and manage your NAS. Now, this is on top of already existing users and groups, so you can use both. You can choose to just create all of your domain users and just primarily use that. It's really up to you, okay? So just if you haven't watched that previous video where we did cover a little bit around the users and the groups, at least the concept around that, go and familiarize yourself with that first. And now we're going to focus on the domain and Active Directory. So what we're going to do is we're going to assume firstly that you do have a domain active. You've got somewhere on your network a domain controller running Active Directory, and you're going to connect to that. So what I'm going to show you is my domain controller. So I've got here in my lab environment, here is a Windows server running Active Directory. So this is a domain controller running Active Directory. I can open up the Active Directory area right here, and I can see a little bit more information. I can see that my domain is called redghost.com, okay? And I've got a number of OUs, or essentially the folders. They're called organizational units, where I've got computers and servers and storage devices and users all configured within here, right? So here are some users in here are some computers, etc. Here's some other computers. And what we're going to do is we're going to connect that Synology NAS so that it appears as a computer, essentially binding your Synology NAS to Active Directory, and then giving the appropriate permissions to users to access my Synology NAS. Now, on top of this is also security groups. So for example, in the users OU down here, there's a whole bunch of these things called security groups, and essentially these contain users within them. So very similar like on the Synology NAS where you had users and then you can assign them to groups. Well, I've got, for example, a domain admin security group, and as a member of this one is these three users. So administrator, Emilio, and test user are three users, members that are part of the domain admin security group. Okay, so that's essentially a little bit of a context there. So first things first is here on our Synology, we've opened up control panel and we've now selected domain/LDAP. Now, LDAP is one technology that we're not going to cover specifically, but essentially you can still use authentication through LDAP. Essentially, it will do a lookup against a domain. But what we are going to be focusing on, and I think it's a better method to actually get your whole Synology NAS authenticated and joined to the domain so you can take full advantage of what Active Directory offers and what it gives you and grants you access to on your Synology NAS. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to tick on Join Domain. All right, that's the very first step. And now you have to enter in your domain. All right, so your domain name. Now, if you remember that my domain name right here is redghost.com. Your domain will be whatever it is in your organization, wherever you are that you are using your Synology NAS. We're going to enter in that domain, right? So I've got redghost.com. I am going to mention right here that you need to ensure that there is no interference between your Synology NAS and your domain/domain controller. You may need to work with other people in your organization to ensure that there's no routes, that there are no firewall ports that are blocked. So you want to make sure that there is full connections between the two devices, that everything is open on the network. The firewall rules are there to be able to allow connection between the two, because otherwise this will fail. All right, so just be aware of that. So first things first is adding my domain, redghost.com. I'm going to add in my DNS server. All right, this is the IP address of my DNS server, of one of them. You can add more than one into here. And that is just left there. Management mode is trusted domain. We're going to just say trusted domain. We're going to leave that as the default. Now, the next step is I'm going to tick on advanced domain options, and I'm going to now input my DC. This is domain controller, IP or FQDN, which is a fully qualified name. All right. Now I know that my fully qualified name of my domain controller is DC Serve 01. So I could do DC Serve 01.redghost.com. I could also input my IP address of my domain controller, which in my case is the same as my DNS server. So this is the DNS server because I've got DNS running on my domain controller. Okay. And that's it right there. What is the domain net BIOS name? Well, in this case, it's also going to be redghost, and my domain FQDN is redghost.com. Registered DNS interface. Well, in our case, we've got 2 LAN ports. So I'm going to select that I want to do both of them. All right. And that is it. Update user group list. We're going to say daily, weekly, monthly, or disable. So what this is going to do is going to automatically scan. We'll cover this in a little bit, but automatically scan and update users and groups as you're adding new users into your domain. So you could do that automatically, daily, weekly, or monthly, or you can set it so that it's disabled and you have to kick it off manually. So we're just going to leave that as disabled, and we'll cover that in a little bit. Okay, so that's the first step. So now we're going to select apply. Actually, before we do that, let's just talk about one thing very, very quickly. Is what this is going to do by default. It is going to create a computer account. So if you remember in here, I've got some computers in here, in the computers OU. Here are some computers. They're real life computers. So by default, the root level here, redghost.com, I've got a computers OU. So this is the very top level. By default, it's going to try to add the name of my NAS into creating a computer within this area right here. The other option that you could do is you could go, for example, let's say you want to put it in here. You could right click and say new computer and then give it the relevant name, which is the name of your Synology NAS. Okay, that's another option as well. And back onto here, we're going to now say apply. What are the administrator username and password of the Windows domain you want to use? This is not Synology NAS credentials. This is Active Directory credentials, so an AD user. So we're going to input that in. I've got an account called Emilio, which is a domain administrator, and we're going to input our password. Specify OU. You can actually say, I want it to go into this OU, or by default, it'll stick it into that computers OU that we saw just before, but we're going to leave that as the default. Select next. Here's what's going to happen, and we're going to select OK. Now, there are a few checks that are now taking place, and we're hoping that you've got ticks across all of them. That looks really good. I've got 6 ticks. Now, if you do not have that, if you've got one of them with a little exclamation mark or something's gone wrong, you're going to have to go and double check why there are connection issues between your Synology NAS and your domain controller. It could be some of the settings that you input right here under the join area. There could be something in here that you've put incorrectly. It could be the credentials that you've used are not the right credentials and you may need something with elevated privileges. Or it could be a network issue, something like a firewall or some routes or some ports or something that is not set up correctly there. So just be aware of that. We can now select finish. Great. So connection status is green. It's connected. So what we can now do is you'll see that there's a couple of new tabs that have now appeared within the domain area. You've got domain users, you've got domain group. Now what we do right here is we can go into one of these and you'll see that it is currently updating a domain user group list. Domain operation will be available in a few minutes. So if you remember back on our domain controller, it's going to populate all of the available users. It's going to do a scan of our entire domain controller, our entire domain, and then populate all of the users. And there you go. So domain users has now been populated. You'll see that all of these are the users that exist on my domain. Under domain group, it's actually gone and it's found all of my security groups. Now, if you remember before, under here, where we looked at this area, user group list, daily, weekly, monthly, disable. So if I go into my domain controller and I'm going to go and create a new user, let's say you've got a team of people, you're adding new users, you're deleting users, you're adding new security groups, you're deleting security groups. Well, they will not populate onto here automatically. You're going to have to tick on or click on update domain data, and it'll actually scan everything again and then populate it. So by actually going into here and setting this to do it daily, it'll do it automatically every whatever. Now, the next step is obviously now to grant these accounts access to something, because just because they're in here doesn't mean they can actually do anything. You won't be able to log in to anything because we haven't allocated them. If I know that Emilio is part of a domain group or a security group called domain admins. So I want by default all of my domain admins to be able to administer this NAS. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to select on edit. You've got the list of all of your shares. Remember, these are corresponding to these right here under our file station. So I'm going to select I want read write against all of those. Don't want quotas and applications. I want to allow all of my applications to be able to get access to that. Okay. And select OK. But you're not going to have full admin rights into your NAS just yet. To do that, we want to go back into domain, and then down the bottom, you've got domain options. You'll see there's a button here called domain administrators. We want to tick on that. And within here, we now want to add the users or the security groups that need to have full admin rights to my NAS. All right. So I'm going to select add, and I'm here going to select domain admins. Add. Let's just do one more because maybe I've got some users that are enterprise admins as well, and add. Okay, we can select finish and apply. And that's it. So now those accounts are ready to go. So if everything has now worked correctly, so we've done domain users, we've done domain groups, we've added them to domain options and added them as a domain administrator for the Synology NAS. All right, we can now close out of here. We can now log off. And we're now going to log in with an Active Directory account. So an AD user and then the password for that account. So you remember that my Emilio user is a domain admin. It's been added to that group. I can now sign in. It's actually gone in and actually created an account. And I've got now full access to my Synology NAS as a Active Directory user.